All right, so unfortunately, Professor Lockhart could not be with us today. So what we're going to talk about is St. Louis militia during the American Revolutionary War. And I'm going to be joined with a couple other people. They're going to support me. Molly and Anthony, you want to come up here? And Christine, you are too, because we're going to have Molly, Anthony, and Christine are the authors of the book that covers the St. Louis militia lists. And so I will get their input, and Patty knows about where some of these militiamen are buried. But before we do that, I'm going to talk about some of the formation, organization, and weaponry of the St. Louis militia, and then we'll get into the research on the lists and where some of these men are buried. So the St. Louis militia company and eventually became two infantry companies, and there was a short-term cavalry company, was part of the Louisiana militia. This was established by, at that time, Louisiana Governor Alejandro O'Reilly. And on February 12, 1770, he authorized 13 companies of Louisiana infantry militia. 4 of these were at New Orleans, 1 was at Natchitoches, 1 at St. Louis, 1 at St. Genevieve, 1 at Point Coupee, and 1 at Appaloosis. The remainder were in the lower Louisiana area outside of New Orleans. The number of infantry companies actually increased, and by 1779, I believe there were 17 companies. Each company was supposed to consist of 74 men, including officers. This was a little of an estimate number. For example, those of you who know about the St. Louis Militia Company, it was actually much, much larger and was eventually divided into a second company. And both the St. Louis and the St. Genevieve militia companies were under the jurisdiction of the lieutenant governor at St. Louis. Now, this is a copy of the orders that were given with respect to the formation of the St. Louis militia and the St. Genevieve militia that were sent to the lieutenant governor at St. Louis at the time. And it goes into somewhat a detail talking about it, but talks about training. And training was supposed to happen in connection with these troops, part of Carlos III's reimagining of colonial defense after the defeats of the 7 Years' War. And as I mentioned, there was a cavalry company, and it was authorized in on January 13, 1779. As you heard, Fernando de Leyva decided he needed to have a cavalry company. There were eventually 3 in Louisiana, 1 at New Orleans, 1 at Natchitoches, which was the site of the other lieutenant governorship, and 1 at St. Louis. Leyva actually proposed the uniforms. We know this from the correspondence. For reasons that I don't really understand, because we all know the British wore red coats, Leyva chose to have red coats for his cavalry company with blue facings. And thanks to Christine, who found a fascinating letter about from the captain of the cavalry company, we know the men made their own, or had their own uniforms made at St. Louis. I want to talk a little bit about free black militia. Prior to Spanish control, when the French controlled Louisiana, there was actually an informal black militia company in New Orleans. And this document you see is actually when the Spanish came, they asked the informal free black militia company to take an oath of allegiance. That's what this document here is. You can see several signatures. Some of them became famous fighters for Galvez during his campaign, but there's also several marks on there as well. And under the Spanish regime, there were actually 2 all-black militia companies that were formed in New Orleans in 1779. These, of course, were free, not enslaved black men. There were approximately 10 to 15 black males of military age in St. Louis during the war. You heard a little bit about Jeanette Fourchette and her husbands. One of her husbands was a man named Pierre Ignace de Valentin. He was the town gunsmith. It's not exactly clear, and we can't really tell sometimes whether these men were in the militia lists. I think, as we're going to hear from a few people, the translation of the list is sometimes difficult with the Spanish and the French, but I'll let them maybe try to take a better stab at that. And as I mentioned, they were training all the men between the ages of 15 and 50 capable of bearing arms were required to be in the Louisiana militia. Militia was required to assemble on Sundays after Mass for training when weather permitted. And generally, it was the regular corporals and sergeants that trained the militia in the basics of quarter wheeling and firing. Now, how much of that actually went on in St. Louis and St. Genevieve, which was a little bit more rugged country, I don't know in terms of wheeling, but perhaps the firing was undertaken. There were certain privileges and expectations for militia. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but it provided somewhat of an incentive to be in the militia because certain laws that were more favorable because you were in the Army were extended to them, at least as far as the officers were concerned. Now here's a listing of one of the lists from the infantry. You can see there are a number of officers that were there. There's a drummer, as Christine pointed out. There was a drummer in St. Louis for most of the period. And we'll talk a little bit about the list here in a minute after I finish the overview. Here's another list of the cavalry company. As I mentioned, it was around 54 men, varied a little bit. These were men, as Jim mentioned, most of whom had their own horses. Some of the early distinguished professors and authors about cavalry, one of them mentioned he doubted are there any men ever actually rode cavalry at St. Louis. And of course, the letter Christine found puts that at serious issue because there's a whole description of a cavalry encounter involving 25 mounted men of the St. Louis Cavalry Company. So in fact, there were quite a few men with horses. Uniforms, we know a little bit about what the uniform colors were. For the Louisiana militia, it was blue coats with red facings. They did have red vests for a period and blue trousers, though this gave way to white after the American Revolutionary War in terms of the vests and the trousers. We don't know exactly how widespread the uniforms were in the upper Louisiana territory. My own personal belief is, studying some of the other descriptions of militia in the other Latin American countries, that people tended to try to get uniforms if they could afford them at all because there was a certain prestige about wearing them. It may have been a combination where they had the uniform coats, particularly in the hunter units, and more practical garb underneath. And of course, we know what the cavalry wore based on Leba's request and the fact that his captain recited that all the men had made their own uniforms. And of course, I put Madame Regauche there only because her role at St. Louis, at least according to legend, was that at the first sign of the attack, she grabbed her husband Ignace's militia coat and ran to the front gate to urge the men on. The militia officers were expected to be in uniform at all times. One observer, not from St. Louis, but in another militia town in the Spanish colonies, was surprised to see merchants wearing uniforms in their shops, even in small towns. Rank distinctions were similar to that to the regular army, and as far as we can tell, the drummer colors do not appear to be reversed. Now, a lot of regular units had reversed colors to distinguish their musicians. Haven't found any evidence of that. Here's a painting of Pierre Rousseau at the time period that he was a captain of the Louisiana Militia Company, so you can get a good example of the blue coat with the red facings. One thing that I've discovered actually since I put this presentation together several months ago was look at the cockade. It is red and white and black. So the Spanish cockade was normally red, and of course the French favored the white, and a lot of times on the East Coast you see the meshing of the French cockade and the American black, so a black and white cockade. but this showed a red and black and white cockade. And so I started looking into this a little bit more, and I found some further references in the sources that this cockade, with another different kind of scheme to it, seems to have been worn later in the war. It was recognized in at least 2 instances, and I brought a copy of a one-page summary with the quotes of the correspondents talking about the cockades, with the 2 pictures that I found. For anyone that's interested, you can come up and get one, particularly if you're a reenactor. And I did talk to the lady that owns Creative Cockades, one of the large cockade makers, and sent her this information, and she told me she's going to be making some cockades like that. So, rank distinctions we talked about. These are ones generally drawn from the Spanish regulars in terms of epaulettes and gorgets and lace and things like that I really don't have time to get into, but at least you can kind of get a quick view that obviously if you were an officer, you not only had more decorations, but the cloth tended to be of a finer quality. Weapons, for those of you that were at the museum last night, you actually got to see some of these. They didn't have a royal armory. Well, let me back up. They did have a royal armory at St. Louis, but there were no fusils or muskets in it like there were at New Orleans. In fact, Christine found one of the lists that was made after the Battle of St. Louis, and the list talks about the cannons and the cannonballs and all the tools that were used with the cannons, but there's not a single mention of a musket anywhere. So the presumption is that they used the common colonial weapon that the Spanish used, the Spanish escopeta musket, which was a very sturdy musket. Wasn't particularly accurate at long range, but it was pretty deadly at short range. And in fact, one of them, the specimen down at the Missouri History Museum, was found inside a wall down along the riverfront when a building was being torn down many years ago. So we know that there were escopetas at St. Louis. They didn't have bayonets because most of the men used their hunting weapons. So that what was favored in the area, and I actually brought a specimen to show, is the French hunting sword. And it's a sword that was used quite commonly in connection with hunting, but is a very deadly weapon that was used by the militia in lieu of a bayonet. And these are usually very decorated. I know you can't see it, but very typically there's the engraving of stags and other animals on here with lots of decorations on it that would adorn these types of swords. Okay, I think other than the fact that what we normally see in terms of the flag was the Burgundy Cross flag, there's a piece of correspondence in New Orleans that talks about the governor asking for 2 of these to be made, so this is the presumption of the type of flag that was flown. We already heard about the militia defense of St. Louis, so I think I'm going to kind of stop it there and ask our panel again some questions about this, and you all can share the microphone. Christine, I'm going to start with you, so don't. No.
Is it on now? Yes.
There we go. So, Christine, if maybe you could talk a little bit about your efforts and how you located all of these militia lists, I guess in the archives of Seville, and you know, how did that process happen, and how easy or hard was that to find them?
Well, through all the research that I was doing, as often happens, you're not looking for something and you find it. Looking for something else, and as in Seville, you get they call it a legajo. It's a folder made of, in the olden days, made of pigskin, and these days are made of carton. And well, sometimes they're, well, whatever. But they are this big. And inside there are like 1,000 folios of paper. And, you know, I'd go through and I'd see 2 lists here, and I'd go through another one, 2 lists over there, through another one, 2 lists over there. And the historians who have written about the Battle of St. Louis, the list that they went after were the ones that would represent the men who were militiamen during the battle. This we don't know exactly. And I'll tell you, we have an idea, but we don't know exactly. So they've only really transcribed a couple of the lists, the ones in July of 1780. Those are the first ones that we have. But anyway, I was just seeing that there were tons and tons of lists that were not transcribed throughout the years, and I thought it was important because, well, someone might be on one list, they might not be on the other, their brother might be on the other, and so on and so on. There are militia lists. They're called pièces de lista, and it's a list that tells the governor how many men capable of bearing arms he has in his town. And on these lists, this is supposed to be done at the end of every year. And in St. Louis, we've only found the ones for 1779 and maybe 1780. And these are great because they give the name, they give the country of origin, they give the height, they give the age, and they give the profession. And I mean, that's wonderful. That's fantastic information. But there are only 4 of those. The other lists that I say that I found that are so many, many, many began to be used after the battle. Like I had said in my talk, that Lieutenant Cartabona was sent down to St. Genevieve, and then Fernando de Leyva dies, and he comes back up, and he brings up militia from St. Genevieve, but now they're going to be paid. And in St. Louis, he's going to also employ the militia and pay them. And the reason for the existence of these lists is that they're going to be paid, and you have to justify the fact that they did their duty. And so that's why these lists exist, and they exist from July 1780, for St. Louis from July 1780 until February 1783, because there was always a risk of attack. There were lots of rumors, oh, now Clark is going to come and attack us. That was later on. And so the governor just kept up the militia until he was really yelled at by the government saying, you're spending way too much money, you have to get rid of them. And so then that stopped almost right, stopped before the Treaty of Paris. And then in St. Genevieve, less, July and August of 1780, and then the end of 1782 to February 1783. So, I mean, that's just wonderful information. And the one thing that's great is that we've come up with 1,000 different names. And so you'll have Jacques Aubuchon, and then he'll be there for like 5 months. And then you'll have Antoine Aubuchon. And so maybe this is a family. And so when we were putting names together, and you can't really do it because you don't know, but you could say they're brothers or cousins, we came up with 550 different families, right? So anyway, what else?
No, that's helpful. And before I get to Anthony, because I know Anthony's actually done some work on this.
Oh, can I say one more thing?
Oh, sure,
just in case I don't get a chance later?
Yeah, no, you'll get a chance. Yeah.
Another thing, and these aren't the militia lists, but I don't know exactly the year, but maybe 1791, they started to issue service records for the militia. And so that's where we find service records for maybe like 5 or 6 militia, but in 1791. But the great thing about this is it gives their history, and it told us that Benito Vasquez defended the northern entrenchment during the battle. Picotet de Bellettre defended the southern entrenchment during the battle. And so that's great information.
And not only that, I just put on the screen a copy of Benito Vasquez's service record saying just the things that you just said.
Okay,
so,
great.
Before we get to Anthony, I want to show you a little bit. So another kind of a part of the list was that after the Battle of St. Louis, the fear was that St. Louis was going to be attacked again, and of course it was. And so they established these advance warning posts, first at Peoria and Piasaw. And for those of you who have been in the Piasaw area. That's actually a picture of the bluffs, and so you can see why they were posted there, so you could see really far down the river. But that as soon as the Sac and Fox came down after their town was burned and switched their allegiance, at least temporarily, to the Spanish, the post at Piasaw was moved farther up on the Oja River, and you can see the number of men that were there. But each list, every month or every couple of months, the names would change. So my ancestor Joseph Rubidoux was at one of these posts for a couple months, but then there's new names in other months, and you can probably add to that. So maybe, Anthony, if you could talk a little bit about, because I know you've written about some of the men that were posted at these advance warning posts, and then you and Molly can talk a little bit about the translation difficulties when you were translating all these lists.
Well, thank you. One of the things that I also want to bring up is that when we first started this project, the three of us were sitting in a restaurant in Madrid in 2014, and I had published one list that had not been published previously in a Louisiana publication called La Racontière that Judy Riffle in Baton Rouge publishes quarterly. And there are almost complete copies of the Cuban papers on microfilm in several repositories in the United States, and I have access to them in Houston at the Clayton Library for Genealogical Research. Not the complete set, but almost, a complete set. So, but the copies are not nearly the quality of what obviously Christine can find in Seville. So the three of us sat down and discussed that we really wanted to publish the entire list. And we talked about it from 2014 until March of 2020. And then Molly is sitting in England, I'm sitting in Texas, Christine is back in Spain. And we committed that May. We got on a Zoom call. I had figured out how to do Zoom, and so I could stay close to my sister across the ocean. And we committed to take separate parts of the book or the list and start this process. And within 26 weeks, we had a publication ready to put up on Amazon. So it was our way of staying connected. It gave us something, and we'd probably still be talking about it if COVID had not happened and forced us to stay at home. But it was truly a labor of love. And in putting the book together, Molly's going to talk about some of the occupations and the things that came out of some of the lists that Christine is talking about, but we felt like we needed an annotated bibliography to talk about some of the important people that we were coming across, Cruzat, so many of the important families. And I wanted to point out that of all the people who were on the list, there were three that were Spanish, who are proven patriots to this day on the list. And one, of course, is Benito Vasquez, who stays and marries Marie Papin, if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Papin. So while the majority are French, there are some, Cruzat is in there, and so is Vasquez and one more. Oh, Ortiz, thank you, Ortiz. And so at the time, the other important point was there are only 22 out of these 1,000 names, roughly, in the DAR database. 22, where there are about 500 of the 2,800 that are in all of the militia lists in Louisiana, between Opelousas, Attakapaw, German Coast, it's New Orleans, et cetera. But we felt like this was such an underrepresented group, important group, that we needed a quick reference for people to be able to have at their fingertips to go find their ancestor. We cross-referenced it to the SAR database, and I don't know which ones are in the SAR database that are not in the DAR database, but in the DAR database, the cross-reference are only about 10 that we jointly share. And DAR has this year already had, and you're going to have to pronounce it for me, one using our book as a reference, one new patriot, and he's on the St. Genevieve militia list.
Julien Choquet. What? Yeah. You want me to pronounce his name?
Yeah, yes, thank you. But as Molly said, is going to tell you more about, get the book. The annotated bibliography will tell you more about these important, the Valle family, We, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, we worked with Bob Mueller on those folks. It's really quite an important list of Revolutionary War figures. Thank you.
Molly, you want to add anything?
Thank you. I think Anthony and Christine have pretty much covered it. But I know for me, living overseas and having a connection and having something to do, working with Christine, as you've seen her PowerPoint presentation today, she's a perfectionist. And so we went through the list. We went through the list. We went through the list. And then we went through the book. And reading colonial documents, as many of you know, because I think there are a lot of people here that are reading colonial documents, I would say one name and Christine would say another name. And also, we have a lot of the French. I'm not that good on French. I'm better on Spanish. But I recommend the book also in, as Christine was saying, in the service work, and that you see what kind of people, the militia, was the boatman, was the cobbler, was the whole town joined in and did the work for the militia. So it's an interesting way to see how the colonial life was at that time. So I highly suggest it. Thank you.
Before we turn it over to Patty, did you have anything else, Anthony? I just wanted to get a comment from either one of the three of you. So my work, when I kind of look at it, that the problem I always have is that the Spanish translated the French names into Spanish. So then trying to figure out, so Laurent Reed becomes Lorenzo Reed, yeah, and it's maddening to me to try to figure out sometimes who they are because of the translation. Maybe you could comment on that.
There's an absolutely wonderful document of passports into Natchez, people who are arriving in Natchez in about 1790. And Kentucky is spelled K-O-N-T-K-Y from the Columbian, and it was an English-speaking scribe trying to read French scribe trying to read English names in a Spanish colony. And Winston DeVille published this in the 1960s, and his commentary on the language and the names is absolutely wonderful. But the way Kentucky and Cumberland are spelled in this document is just absolutely, and it is true. And people, when you're looking at these documents, it's Pierre, it can be very amusing.
No, and I guess I would just say that these documents were hard to transcribe because what we did in our book was we wrote them in their original language. So the names and like the occupations, they're all in Spanish or they're in French, although we have given like a little glossary and an example in English. Now we had to go through and make sure that every single one of the errors that they had in the original document, we had in what we did, because we wanted to do something. We just wanted to reproduce the document as it was. We didn't want to fix it, because you can't do that. You might be changing something. And when you look for your ancestors, you have to look up every kind of way it might be spelled. So anyway, it was very, very challenging.
And besides you, Steve, is there anyone else in the room that descends from any of the militia at St. Louis or St. Genevieve? I know we have some other Louisiana. We have two here. Wow.
This gentleman descends from Ortiz.
Oh, do you?
All right, well, you want to hand the microphone to Patty? So Patty has done quite a bit of work in terms of genealogy and finding out where some of the militiamen are buried, and much to my surprise, a number of them are buried in St. Charles. So maybe, Patty, you could tell us a little bit about what you've done and what you've found.
The reason, or the way I got pulled into all this, I'm just a regular genealogist. I'm the registrar for the St. Charles chapter. I love to do research. Steve came and talked at the St. Charles County Historical Society quarterly luncheon. This was pre-COVID, and talked about his book and asked for questions from the crowd. And the last question asked was, did any of these men who fought in St. Louis come from St. Charles? And he said, you know, I don't know. And for some reason, it stuck in my head. COVID hits, and then I see this book come out, and I'm thinking, what have I got to do? Nothing but sit here at home and research. So I ordered the book, Amazon, it's always good for that, and I started looking through the list and didn't get too many pages in and saw all of these St. Charles names and could not believe it. So I couldn't understand, okay, they weren't here during the war in St. Charles because it was just a small trading post, and the only time anybody really was at the trading post was when they were trading. There wasn't really a town set up so that people could, you know, live there, develop any kind of relationships or anything. There was no church, which, you know, is the main focus of any small town, especially for the Frenchmen. So I couldn't understand how they got there and did all this stuff. So I started making a list of the ones I knew best of the names. Now, I'm not from St. Charles. I'm from St. Louis. So over the years, I've just heard a lot of names in St. Charles, and that's what I started with, the list in my head. I hit about 30 and I stopped, and I said, I just can't do any more. Okay, so I'm gonna just start on each one and try and find out what I can find out. So I picked out 12 that I figured that I wanted to prove to DAR that they were here and that they had moved up to St. Charles. And what I had found out was Louis Blanchette, who was the original founder of the little trading post in St. Charles, actually was a fur trader, trapper, and many of his friends, that's where they met, here I keep saying here because I keep thinking I'm in St. Charles, but in St. Charles, and they would go from St. Charles to St. Louis, to Port-au-Jessus, to Cahokia, to Kaskaskia, St. Genevieve. All of these towns were so intermingled, and marriages, of course, started intermingling too, and many of the Indians. A lot of these fur traders married Indians because the Indians were very grouped in certain places around St. Louis and St. Charles. So, and of course, as Frenchmen, they did get married in the church, and the main church was what we consider the old cathedral, or Louis King of, only 10 minutes left, Louis King of France. And so that's where I started to see how many got married there, how many had children and were baptized there. So that was mostly my documentation. That, the 1776 census, and that was in St. Louis. And then in 1791, the Spanish did a census in St. Charles because all of a sudden St. Charles was being settled. And what happened was Louis Blanchette moved from St. Louis and actually settled in St. Charles. He was getting older probably. He wanted to get off the river and out of the woods. And so he brought all of these guys that he served with or that he hunted with. And they came up and settled. I started out with about 30. I narrowed it down to 12. Well, I guess I narrowed it down to 14. And they were all buried and had gone to the first church, the first Catholic church that was built and had a cemetery in St. Charles, and that was Borromeo, St. Charles Borromeo Church. It has moved a couple times. The cemetery's moved 3 times. So it was difficult trying to find the records, and a lot of problem came in with record finding because those were the basic records I was looking for because they told so much about the families. But we had a traveling priest, or a couple different traveling priests, and they went from Cahokia to Kaskaskia to St. Genevieve to St. Louis, and everything ended up back in St. Louis mostly. So if, he fell off his horse, or if he, lost the records in a creek or something, a lot of those records were missing. So there were holes in things. So it was hard to prove to, where's she at? Genevieve. Genevieve was the one I would send in all of the applications to try and get graves marked for these men, because I think it's very important that St. Charles did not know about this. People in St. Charles didn't know that they had people who had fought in the Revolutionary War. And I think it's really important to honor these guys. And then some of the St. Louis chapter started asking me if I would help them prove some of the St. Louis people, because it seems like all the graves were moved from St. Louis City, the early St. Louis City, out to the outer edges of town. And there's a huge cemetery called Calvary for the Catholic people. And then right next to it is Bellefontaine, and that was where the Protestants were buried. So when all the mass graves were dug up and then reburied into these places, that's usually where they ended up. So if we could get a plaque for each one of those cemeteries and then put all their names on them, I think that would be really cool. So I'm trying really hard. She's going to help me. And these guys are really going to help me to get them through, because there are rigid standards and for DAR to have people proven. So we have 7 proven out of the first 14 I sent in. So a couple more, and then we'll start on the next 14.
But a key thing is the Archdiocese agreed to mark it.
Yes, yes. Yeah, now that was a couple years ago when I started.
Would you repeat
So-
that question so it gets picked up?
Oh, the Archdiocese agreed to let us mark in Borromeo and with a plaque. So, but that was a couple years ago, and things are getting stringent there too. So, I do have the original letter, but it's only for those. But we'll keep trying.
Wait, can we hand the microphone, otherwise it won't pick up your question?
Patty, I know you were researching St. Charles. Did any of the people who fought the Battle of St. Louis end up in Florissant?
Many are in Florissant.
All right, wait a minute, Patty, you're going to have to repeat it.
Many are in Florissant. In fact, you'll find many of the names, and I was talking to Marty Abashan. Where's he? He came up to my table, and I said, oh, are you from Florissant? Because I know the Abashan names from there. And he goes, no, I'm from St. Genevieve. Or he's from that area. So there are those families that were really into all of these different little cities. Many of the Frenchmen came from Kaskaskia because they were chased out by the British. And before that, they were in Vincennes, and before that, Canada. So you can see you can follow it, yeah, because of the church records. The church records are so important.
All right, we probably have time for maybe a question or two. Anybody have a question that they would like that we haven't already heard? If not, okay, go ahead.
I just want to say one more thing. Many of you, particularly the SAR, are familiar with Robert Churchill's work from 1919, where the first time someone was in the archive in Seville to extract the names of the Louisiana militia. And that's what Christine was talking about. They just picked one from each. And there are a lot of lists in that book that are too early and too late. So there are a lot of errors when people are first joining DAR and SAR, and many of those lines are closed. But I want to bring attention to the most important person behind that book, and her name was Irene Aloha Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T. And she was born in Luray, Colorado. Her father owned a gold mine, and she was sent back east to boarding school, and she ran away. She came home and told her parents, I'm going to Mexico, I want to learn Spanish. And she became the governess for the vice president of Mexico to learn Spanish. In the meantime, her father dies. The Opera House in Luray, Colorado is named for him. And she takes her mother to Havana, Cuba with gold nuggets sewn into her skirt, the hem of her skirt. And she goes to Havana where in 1914 she joins the Daughters of the American Revolution. And then from there she starts a newspaper. To this day, the definitive history of Cuba is her book. And anyway, she takes her mom to Seville, and she stays till the 1930s, adopts a young girl, but she is the woman who transcribed every one of those lists that are in Robert Churchill. And he gives her a little bitty thank you on page 52. But just go Google her. She was just one of the most remarkable women ever. And we marked her grave 2 years ago. She's buried in Pueblo, Colorado. I just had to bring her up.
Okay, before I turn it over to Joan, I got 2 housekeeping matters. One, I think Joan had passed around this review sheet. If you could please fill it out. The second item, and why this would be helpful, is that the museum, the Heritage Museum, has decided to extend an option for the museum exhibit for another year, so it would take it to May of 2025. And so we would have another opportunity to do this again next year with all new topics if there is sufficient interest. So please, on your review, indicate if it's something that you would like, because it takes a long time, like 9-10 months, to get something like this organized. And if there is an interest, there's a question about proposed topics. Like I've had people that want to know about Henry Hamilton or whatever it is. And we're going to have some discussions about it in the upcoming months. Okay, Joan?
Well, and the evaluations, if you want, when you exit, you can put them on the table over there. I just wanted to say a couple of times I've asked, oh, are you in the DAR? Oh, are you in the SAR? Oh, I think maybe I had an ancestor who was. If you're not, there are lots of people who will help you. And, these girls, I'm going to cry for a second. Because
We have the French list. We have all the French lists.
we have made such good friends. And we've traveled in Spain, and when our daughter was in Spain, Molly was her Spanish mommy taking care of her. And when her son Alonzo was over here, we were taking care of him. And it's just a fun group. And I'm sure the guys are fun too. But I mean, the DAR is a really fun group. So ladies, please consider that. Please. And sorry, I got weepy over that, but I've made good friends. So I think we would say thank you very much for coming. The museum opens up at noon. So if you haven't been out there and you want to go out there, today is, and the marking is at 3:00. Yes? So, Steve, anything else you want to say? Yes?
Standing ovation for all of you.
Good job. All right, with that said, I guess we'll see you next year.